All right. So good morning, everybody. Sorry, it is good evening in Melbourne. It is good morning in New York City, which is where I am based, and it is 4 a.m. So please excuse my disheveled look. This morning, or this evening, rather, we are here with Jane Harper, who is the author of The Dry, and actually her second book has already come out, Force of Nature. So we're very excited. I have heard only good things about this book. I have heard a lot about this book this month because we've been reading it for our May Girly Book Club. So Jane, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
It's very exciting, as I was telling you just a minute ago, to actually host you in an Australian time zone, but also to read a book by an Australian author. I got a lot of feedback. We do have chapters in Perth, Melbourne, Ballarat, and Sydney. So I got a lot of feedback from the Australians saying how pleased they were to see somebody from their home country.
Oh, great. That's great.
So to start things off, I was hoping you could just give us a bit of background about yourself. I actually have 5 kind of like hot questions that just give us a little insight into who you are as a person more so than an author.
Yeah, sounds good.
We'll do that, and then I'll give you a couple minutes just to talk about your writing and kind of your experience as an author.
Okay.
So the first question is the last book you read.
The last book I read, the last book I read was The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, which is fairly new. Stuart Turton wrote that, who's an English author, and it's kind of a mystery with a really sort of great kind of twist setup. I really enjoyed it.
That is by Bloomsbury. I was actually just pitched that book by Bloomsbury.
Oh, okay. It's very interesting.
The next question is your favorite genre of book.
I like books. I like mystery books. I like sort of fast-paced books with a bit of suspense. I think I kind of like my favorite genre, I guess, is the genre I write in. So yeah, things with a few twists and turns, ideally.
Okay, very good. And the most exciting trip you've ever taken?
Oh gosh. Well, actually, I did. I'm currently writing my 3rd book, and as part of that, I went just recently to Outback Queensland, which is in Australia, and I drove across the Outback with a retired Outback police officer.
Oh, wow.
So that was really fascinating. That was probably something I never would have done if I wasn't working on the book. So that was really exciting.
Yeah, a trip that nobody else would ever do. That's awesome. And is your office, whether you have one at work or home, or we'll find out more about that, but is it super organized or organized chaos?
It's actually super organized, unlike a lot of the rest of my my life in my house. But I have very little in there. I just have pretty much a desk, a computer. I have some copies of the books, and that's kind of it. Actually, I have absolutely nothing else to distract me in there.
And that leads nicely into our last question, your writing habits. Do you sit down and write for 5 hours at a time? Do you write for 2 days and nobody's allowed to bother you? Or is it an hour here, an hour there?
So at the moment, I have a 20-month-old daughter. So I have to kind of fit in writing a little bit around her schedule as well. So I do a lot of but I do actually treat it as almost like a 9-to-5 job. I do it every day, and I go into the office, and I start in the morning, and then I keep going until well into kind of the afternoon. And at the moment, certainly when I'm kind of close to deadline, like I would do it every day.
Right. Awesome. And you are close to deadline right now. Is that correct?
I'm doing the edits on my 3rd book, which is called Lost Man, is coming out in October in Australia and in February in the US and UK. So I'm approaching a deadline quite soon on that.
Well, that's good news for us because I've already read Force of Nature. So I'm sure that our members are pleased to hear that they can expect something else from you very soon. All right, so we'll go right into, if you want to just give us a background of how you got into writing. You've only written 2 books, so you might not have been publishing books for the last 20 years. So if you can give us a little background and how you got into it and all of that fun stuff, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, sure. So I was a print journalist professionally, and that was what I did straight out of university. and that was what I'd done my whole career, and I'd always worked on newspapers, and but I'd always really wanted to write a novel. Like I was a big reader when I was younger, and I really it was something I'd always wanted to do, but I'd never really had I think the confidence actually to try, and I'd really struggled to find the motivation that was involved, because it's a huge undertaking. And then in 2014 I sort of finally kind of realized that I was going to have to, if I was ever going to do it, I was going to have to do it around my full-time job. So I really, again, was sort of really struggling to kind of motivate myself. So I found an online 12-week online writing course, which was starting quite soon. And that was, this one particular one was run out of London by a literary agency. And as part of that, you had to send off a synopsis and a first chapter of the book you were working on. So I sort of sat down and thought, what would I like to write? And I thought I'd love to write something about Australia and something with, kind of a mystery element. And I came up with the idea for this book that became the Dry ultimately. And I sent it off, got a place on this course, and then it was over those 12 weeks I actually started working on, started writing the novel, and I managed to kind of finish like a really rough, short first draft. I kept on refining it over the next few months, and then 6 months later I entered the draft I'd kind of most recently completed in a competition here in Melbourne called the Victorian Premier's Literary Award for an Unpublished Manuscript. And I entered that really just more as a deadline for myself, just to kind of try and just make it sort of the point where I felt I could share it and maybe hopefully get some feedback and see if it was working or not. And I actually ended up winning that competition. So from there I got an agent and I got publisher interest, and that's kind of how it all came together for me, really.
That's amazing. I was actually reading a lot about you, and your kind of like projection to publishing was very quick and I mean very celebrated. Like you kind of like a very sick, like, I mean, and do you think that comes from being a journalist beforehand?
Yeah, I think for sure. And I think probably one of the things that I've sort of, realized, I think, since I became published was that actually, it all felt very quick. Once I won that manuscript prize, I suddenly did have all this interest. It was quite a quick process from there to actually becoming published. But it had taken me 10 years to get there, to that point. I mean, I'd been writing every day, on the newspapers, and I was really used to kind of writing the deadline and writing about all kinds of different things. And I'd had this kind of ambition that I just never acted on for so long. And so it was sort of at the point where I actually was ready to sit down and write my novel. I was so ready, I think, because I'd just been kind of spinning my wheels for a decade waiting to get to that point. So it was sort of, once it happened, it was quite quick, but I feel like I have quite a lot of background to kind of get me to the stage where I was ready for that.
Sure. And it's so interesting because when you do look at the trajectory, it does seem like you were like an immediate success. So it's interesting to hear like the background and how long it actually takes to get to a spot where you are ready to publish. Yeah.
And I think being a journalist really helped as well, because I had, I was so used to kind of, writing regularly and writing every day and, writing sort of on demand, really, So when it actually came to writing fiction, which is, you have to be quite disciplined and quite sort of self-motivated and focused. And I think if I hadn't had all those years of journalism, I'm not sure I would have been in a position to write the novel when I did, really.
Absolutely. Ladies, just a little bit of admin here. You're absolutely welcome to ask questions. There's not very many of us on the line, so if you want to turn off your mic and ask your question, please feel free to chime in. If you want to turn your video on, you're absolutely welcome. You have to look better than I do at 4 a.m. Oh, there we go. Here we go. We have a question already from Katie. So I will read this to you before I go in. I have a bunch that were emailed to me as well from our other chapters that could not be on the line today. But she's written, as a journalist, it's often all about brevity. How was it different when writing novels, especially since both your books are so heavy on atmosphere? Good question.
Yeah, great question. And actually, interestingly, I think I approach fiction writing actually in a very similar way to how I would approach my journalistic writing, which is like, yeah, sort of being quite focused on brevity, because I think one of the things that's when I first moved from started writing fiction when I was trying to write The Dry. I was sort of overcompensating because I thought, oh, it needs all this description and it needs all this sort of, I don't know, people moving around all the time and you know, looking at things and you know, describing things to each other. And you know, and early on, actually, when I was doing this online course, you know, the teacher said to me, like, it's really slowing things down. It's not, you know, it's not really adding anything. And honestly, when she sort of said that, and I was almost given permission to take out all the, you know, all the description, all the extra stuff, it was so freeing, because I felt I can just focus on the important things, which is what I always did as a journalist. And I think by doing that, you still can bring out like a lot of atmosphere and a lot of, you know, things to help the reader get the picture. And it's almost better in a lot of ways because it's not drowned out by everything else. You can really cherry pick the most important things and try and just really focus on the things that are really going to paint that picture without it just getting bogged down and really slowing the story down. So, yeah, I always try and, just think, how can I sort of do this scene in the sort of quickest and least, the least amount of words, I guess.
Maybe that's what made it so enjoyable too. We have a question here from Erin B, who's also on the line. She is also from Melbourne, actually. She wrote, thank you for writing such an amazing novel that really describes some of the struggles that have affected so many Australians. Do you have a real town or experience that you used this book for? And I know you were born in the UK, but you moved to Australia when you were little, and you were actually in a small town in Australia for quite a few years. Did you draw on that experience to write the small town community?
So actually not so much, because when I not so much that, but I did get some experience. It was more things actually that happened a bit later. So yeah, you're right. I was born in the UK and then actually lived out in Australia for a few years, 6 years actually, with my family. And we weren't in a small town, anything really like the book in The Dry. Like, it was kind of a sort of small, actually more suburban community really. But then when I moved back to the UK with my family for high school and rest of high school and university, and I worked a few years there, and then I moved back to Australia myself in 2008. And a lot of the experience from The Dry actually came from that second move. When I returned as an adult, I was working on a newspaper in Geelong, which is outside Melbourne, which has quite a big circulation area, which takes in a lot of kind of rural and coastal towns. And so you're constantly kind of listening to people talk about their communities and the issues that are affecting them. And even, even when it's not sort of specifically, say, like the drought related, I think you learn so much from just listening to what people are saying, and more about how, regardless of what the issue is, how that kind of creates this ripple effect in a community, and it sort of impacts people's lives and their relationships with their neighbours, and how they have to spend their money and what their hopes are for their children. So, a lot of it was coming from like years of doing kind of community journalism and just really trying to sort of capture, I guess, what happens when you've got a whole community under a pressure that you just really don't have a lot of control over.
Well, it certainly worked. I do have another question from Katie, but I'm going to ask you one of my own questions. I just want to know, I read Force of Nature immediately after I read The Dry, and I just wanted to know, having only written 2 books to date, was it always a foregone conclusion that you would have a reoccurring character? And is he going to appear again in your 3rd book?
So when so I always knew. So Aaron Falk is obviously the character you're referring to, who's the lead guy in The Dry, and then in Force of Nature. And I think he was always going to be in Force of Nature. But when I was writing The Dry, I didn't really have any concept of Force of Nature. I didn't really know if The Dry was going to get. I didn't think it was going to get published, honestly, and so I didn't really think beyond that at all. I was just concentrating really on trying to finish it and make it the best I could, really. So, but then as soon as I got, the publishing contracts, like sort of very early on, you get asked, what's next? What are you thinking of next? And so I sort of came up with this idea for Force of Nature, and he was in it from the start. So I guess as long as the book was, you know, an idea, he was in it, and it was great to kind of have the chance to kind of pull out a little bit more of his, you know, I guess his daily life. You know, in the Dry, it's very focused on the events in his hometown, and a lot of his sort of the background to you know, where he grew up. Whereas in Force of Nature, it's a little bit more surrounding his sort of day job, I guess, and who he is outside of there. And I think I do. Yeah, I think I will be returning to him, but he's actually not in the third book, which is it's very similar in tone of feel. So I think it will, you know, appeal. I think readers who enjoyed the first two will hopefully enjoy this one as well. It's another Australian mystery, and it's, you know, very sort of similar, you know, style. But and the only reason really he's not in this one is just because the location and the kind of the family involved at the heart of the book. I just couldn't really find a good way to get him in. Like, he just wasn't the right character to tell the story. So if I could have got him in, like I would have, but I felt it was just better using different characters for this one. But I think, yeah, absolutely, I'd love to come back to him in future novels.
Just to mention, for anybody who hasn't read the other one, they're completely standalone novels. You don't have to have read one to read the other, even though there is a reoccurring character. And he's extremely likable, so I'm glad that he's going to come back at some point.
Oh, good.
The next question, Katie, I'll do yours now. And she wants to know if you can talk a little bit about writing mysteries and how you balance giving clues with not giving away the reveal. How do you plot your storyline?
Yeah, so for me, it's good question actually, because it's a very it's sort of evolved actually for me. So for the Dry, I always have the end. It always starts for me with like, I kind of have I guess like a hook that is something that interests me. So, you know, in the Dry, it was this sort of town under this pressure, and a death of a family in that community, and how that kind of, I guess, rippled out and affected the community. And then for Force of Nature, it was this idea of 5 sort of corporate city women sent out reluctantly into this bushland, and things go wrong very quickly for them, and how they kind of react to each other and to their situation. And I always have the kind of start, and I always have the end. Like, I know how it's going to resolve. And then both times I've also had points along the way. So I kind of know a few kind of key areas, key things that will happen to help me get from the start to the end. And then I just sort of would do quite a lot of drafts. Like, I would kind of try and get through to the end, and then once you've got the skeleton down, then you can kind of work out the best place to sort of plant the clues. I have to say, for the third one, I actually approached it slightly differently, and I still had to start in the end, but I actually planned it like really, really thoroughly. So I actually sort of sat down before I wrote anything and worked out where what clues I wanted to give, and in what ways, and what characters were going to reveal certain things. And I really plotted it out so that I knew exactly where things would happen. But even then, it's still, like, I think, a real ongoing process, because you sort of get a sort of a draft down, and then immediately, once that's kind of out of your head, you can sort of see, hopefully you can see where you can improve it, and you can see actually if I end this chapter a little bit earlier, it's a bit more of a cliffhanger. And a lot of it is just about actually where you how you start and end chapters, and trying to kind of pick, I guess, those high notes, a high note to go in on and a high note to finish on, and try not to bog people down too much in the middle. And often that's enough to, I guess, keep people turning the pages.
Well, I think it was very effective the way you did it. I think when sometimes you're reading these novels, everything is just like a little too convenient.
Right.
So at our book club meeting this month, everybody was saying, like, they just really didn't know, and that's the making of a good crime book, is that they don't know to the end actually who's done it. So one thing that did come up in the meeting was that they thought that the relationship between the police officer who was investigating the crime and then the detective who came in, it was a little convenient that he had such access to the crime, even though he was in finance, and it seemed that seemed a little strange.
Oh yeah, except I sort of yes, I think with that though, that was kind of why I had I tend to agree. I mean, why he's not there on official business, and he's doesn't have any real authority in that. It was kind of almost a deliberate choice in a way to keep him separate, though, because I wanted him to. So Aaron Falk is the one who he grew up in that town, but now he lives in Melbourne. He's a financial. He's a financial detective. Really, he doesn't really have any experience with homicides particularly, and he's not the local cop either. So I wanted him on one level to be like a real fish out of water and kind of be, not someone who had a lot of, sort of current ties with his community. And he's got a lot of ties in his past, but not so many current ones. And so, quite rightly, because of that, I mean, how would he then get involved with it? And so that was why I kind of had him having sort of developing this sort of friendship with the Reiko, who is the actual local police officer there, and he's a state police and he does have authority over that area, but he's quite new himself, so he's only been in town for a few weeks when this happened, so he doesn't have the local background and he doesn't have the kind of the sort of connections that someone who's been there longer would have. So I think I thought between the two of them, you've got a guy who has kind of this personal connection, this sort of long kind of history and all and knowledge that he can draw on, and then you've got Reiko who has the authority to act. And so I thought between the two of them, that was kind of the best way to sort of approach this while still, I guess keeping Falk as a bit of an outsider.
Okay, I have another question here from somebody in Denver. They sent it to me. Denver sent me a bunch of questions that they had in their meeting this month, and there's two that I absolutely have to ask. So the first is, does the dry have a bigger meaning than a drought in Australia? They felt that they were missing something as it seemed, dry. But I mean, perhaps it doesn't, as Aaron mentioned, like how big a deal it is. Perhaps they don't understand how big a deal a drought is if you haven't experienced one.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, if that's what they're asking, I guess that's exactly it. Really, I mean, it's sort of the drought is, Australia is such a agriculture is such a huge part of our country and our economy, and the weather patterns here are so extreme that it really it can make or break whole communities really. And the droughts go on for years, years and years and years, and people really struggle, but at the same time it's their livelihoods, and and as a country we need the farmers to succeed. So I mean the droughts are like a big deal, and I mean it's something that people talk about a lot. I mean, I remember when I first moved back to Australia in 2008, there'd been a drought for several years, and when it rains, people would literally go to the window and sort of talk about it. It was, it was quite, and we on the news would tell you how low the dams were and all kinds of things. So, maybe that's something that I guess outside Australia, maybe it's harder to imagine, but certainly within Australia, it's a serious and ongoing issue for us.
I feel like as I get older, I hear more and more conversations about weather, so I can't even imagine when it's like. All right, so I have another question from Denver, and I promised them I would ask this because they want to know who Latches' father is desperately.
Oh, okay. Well, because I actually, look, I've not for myself really. Like I kind of deliberately left that open so people could sort of see what I think. I suppose if I had to come down on one side or another, I would say I would suspect it was Luke actually. But yeah, so, I think it is. It's probably quite annoying when an author says that. Like I don't know either. But I think that's kind of part of Gretchen's sort of. I don't know, her character, that she just, would keep something like that to herself. But I think I would think, given their history, I would suspect it was Luke actually.
I think there was a bunch of clues, like he was holding the baby when it was a baby, but it didn't really seem like something he would do in his character. And
yes, I agree.
Anyways, thank you for making a decision if you had to, if you were pushed to it. But yeah, leaving it to the reader to decide. Katie wants to know if you've ever seen a difference in the reader reaction in Australia versus other countries. Your book has actually been published in 20 countries, which is incredible. And she also wants to know what the Australian response has been because the book is all over the US as well.
Yeah, look, the response has been overwhelming, really, and I've been absolutely kind of thrilled by the response from like readers and booksellers, certainly in Australia, but elsewhere as well. And I really had no concept of how well or otherwise the book would travel. Like I didn't really know if people outside Australia would like get it, I suppose, or even be interested in it. And but yeah, it's been amazing. Like the sort of the kind of number of people who responded to it in in the US and the UK and also in Europe and places have been fantastic. And I think the sort of, I guess the interesting thing for me in terms of the overseas response has been the different issues that they pick up on, or I suppose like the Denver question, the things that maybe people don't are quite alien to people. In Australia, like drought is, I think we're all on a very common page with that. So you don't really get a lot of questions about that particularly because everybody kind of knows it. Whereas, I mean, that was quite interesting for Denver. That was a talking point for them. I get other questions like from from sort of European countries often who see have asked if there's sort of metaphors in things like the flies or the rabbits. So they're supposed to be kind of a metaphor for something bigger, often like a religious connotation. But actually, again, in Australia, we just have a lot of flies and we have a lot of rabbits. So, so a lot of things that, are just, for me, we just, purely physical description. Sometimes people overseas have kind of, read more into it or attached like another meaning to it than what maybe, the readers in Australia would.
I feel like you're so modest. This book has been optioned by Reese Witherspoon. And I mean, hopefully, I don't know if you can talk about that at all. Maybe sometimes that gets very hush hush, but hopefully it will be set in Australia.
Yeah, no, it will. It's yes, I can tell a little bit about it actually. So it's yes, it's sort of being worked on at the moment actually. So a script is being done, which is exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing that. And and it is sort of scheduled to be filmed in Australia, actually in Victoria, which is where the book itself is set. So with and I guess by that definition, you have like a larger Australian cast, which is great as well. And so it's going, it's really exciting. Like, and I think, for me, the most important thing is I'd love to see the movie be a real sort of true reflection of the book. I guess that would be, the most important thing for me. And setting in Australia is, a fantastic, part of that.
The Force of Nature is also based in Australia. Do you identify as an Australian more so than a Brit?
Yeah, I do now for sure, and I've always had dual nationality. So I've always kind of had both passports and things. But certainly now, I mean, I've been here. When I was a child, like I spent sort of 6 years over here, which doesn't sound like a lot, but actually at that age, I was 8 when we moved over, and it was actually like a huge kind of part of my life. It was quite sort of formative years, I guess, and a lot of sort of my cultural references and my hobbies and interests and my friends and things obviously were all Australian. And then when I came back as an adult, it was interesting because I had these memories, but I was able to see everything with slightly fresher eyes as well. So I think I sort of appreciated the things that make Australia unique more than I would have had I grown up here my whole life. So, but then, I've been here sort of 10 years now. My husband is Australian. My baby has an Australian passport. So I feel like, and I definitely feel, I mean, I love it here. Like, I feel like it's a great country and I really, absolutely identify with it.
And you'll have to excuse my ignorance, but do you have an Australian or like what do people say about your accent?
No, it's funny. It depends who I'm talking to. If I'm in England, people always say, "Oh, you sound so Australian," and then, but sometimes when I'm over here, like a lot of Australians can say, "Oh, so you're English." So I think it falls a bit in the middle. And it depends who I'm talking to as well. If I'm talking to English people, it probably comes out a bit more English and vice versa. So yeah, it's a bit of a mix, I think.
Okay, perfect. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I can hear here you have somebody in the background who probably needs
Oh
you.
gosh, yeah, that's so she's fine. She's fine. It's all
Okay. But I do have one more question from Erin and then just a wrap up question. She wants to know what the inspiration behind Ellie's story was.
Oh, look, I think for her, there was it's interesting actually because her character changed a bit over the draft. So initially, very initially, in the very first sort of I guess um, draft of the book, I actually had Ellie as a lot older than um, than Aaron and Luke when they were younger. So she was actually sort of almost like half a generation older than them. And I guess more like maybe like a babysitter figure rather than a friend, And I think, but then as I sort of kept on working the books, it became obvious it was a much sort of better dynamic if Aaron, Luke, Gretchen, and Ellie were all kind of contemporaries. So that's kind of how that sort of foursome came together, really. And I think for her, I suppose it's that sort of, I suppose I wanted her character to be someone that has kind of, I suppose, slightly haunted, Aaron his whole life, really, a little bit. Maybe the what ifs and maybe what he could have done differently, if anything. And I think a lot of us have that kind of sense sometimes in our past, maybe not, hopefully, in that sort of as dramatic a way as that. But I think a lot of us maybe look back at our childhood friends and childhood relationships, and you do have those questions as an adult, about maybe people you knew and things you did, and how you might respond differently when you're older. So I guess that's kind of how her character came about.
And my last question for you to wrap up today is if you can tell us Simone, I'll just push these in. I'll push this in. I was very surprised to find The Dry was your first book. It was so cleverly written and grabs you straight away. I read Force of Nature first and thought you had been writing for years. Well, she has been. She's a journalist.
Oh, thank you, Simone. That's lovely. Thank you.
So my last question is just if you can share anything with us about your new book to try and whet anybody's appetite for if you haven't read Force of Nature, I absolutely recommend that you do because it's excellent. But if you can tell us anything else about what you're writing now, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. No, I'd love to. So it's called The Lost Man, and it's coming out on October 23rd in Australia, and then in February, as I said, in the UK and the US. Yes, it's very sort of, it's another Australian mystery. It's got a lot of kind of suspense, and this one is set out in, this isn't a true outback, so we're talking like red dirt, desert, nothing for miles around, of Queensland. And it's set on one of these, a remote cattle property where you have these sort of people who work on these properties, and then they're sort of 3 hours from the nearest town, and their neighbour is 3 hours away, and their kids go to school, on the internet and all kinds of things. So they're very, very isolated. And it's set around this family with 3 brothers, and a man is found dead on their property miles from his house. His car is like, with all his supplies, is miles away from him, and he's he's died from exposure for reasons unknown. So I hope the people who enjoy Dry and Force of Nature will also enjoy reading this one. It's got the setting is just incredible. I couldn't believe when I was out there in terms of the kind of landscape I saw when I was researching it, and it's such a very unusual sort of community setting as well. So I love it. I've loved working on it, and I've really loved researching it. So I hope that readers enjoy it as well.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for writing. I mean, in general, it's just such an enjoyable. Both of them are such enjoyable books, and it's done extremely well with our book club. We read it globally, and we have 70,000 members. So hopefully you have a lot of new readers to look forward to your upcoming books, and we just really appreciate your time today as well.
Oh, thank you. And thank you to everybody who's tuned in the middle of the night as well. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for choosing it for book club as well. That's, I really, it's so great to have that kind of support and the word of mouth as well. So thank you so much for choosing it.
Awesome. Well, take care, ladies. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope everybody has a good night or day or wherever you are. Goodbye.